Hello, everybody, and welcome. We're going to talk a little bit about abolitionism today, and this looks pretty crowded here. But I think, as you'll see, it can be fairly straightforward. First of all, abolitionism means to abolish, from the word abolish, to abolish something, and in this case, abolitionists, of course, work to abolish or end slavery. And you would think, okay, well, that sounds like a great idea. How can there be any sort of different, not different, but how can there be any sort of disagreement about that? You say, well, it's not necessarily disagreement. Everyone had the same goal, but they had different approaches on how they felt it would really be most effective to achieve that goal. The first one we'll take a look at was the violent overthrow approach, which kind of speaks for itself. And violent overthrow approach, obviously, is that, hey, we're going to rise up and we're going to, attack and potentially kill any of the slave owners and those that support slavery. And this sort of, echoed back to maybe a little bit of the Nat Turner insurrection. And the big effect that this had on people was that it terrified those in the South, and even some in the North as well. Anytime you threaten, violent overthrow, and people are going to get nervous about that. And so the other thing was, how practical would this be? Perhaps in certain areas it would be much more practical, but in terms of what group had the population advantage as well as the arms advantage, it probably was not going to be something that would be long-term successful unless there was significant support from white people, and just not clear that would ever work that way. Gradual emancipation, gradual, of course, meaning it takes time, slowly but surely, sort of like the old slow and steady wins the race. And of course, emancipation, that means to, freedom. And this was very popular at first with the ones that started the abolitionist movement. And the whole point behind this was that slavery would be dismantled over several years to allow society to adapt to the new paradigm. And paradigm is just a worldview, a way that one looks at the world. And so, for this, people said, okay, when change happens slowly, there's a much greater opportunity for change to be permanent, as opposed to if change just happens very, very quickly. Sometimes that can lead to instability and the change not really sticking. Another group, or another, I should say, not group, but another suggestion, another way to end slavery, was this one called recolonization. And there were several societies or several groups that advocated this. One was the American Colonialization Society, and this attempted to move free African Americans and former slaves out of the country to other locations such as the Caribbean or Africa. And in 1824, I know this is very, very early, even before the Nat Turner insurrection, the American Colonization Society actually founded a country, and it was the country of Liberia. Which, if you look at their flag, it's very similar to the American flag. And that's a home, founded as a home for former slaves and for African Americans and former slaves. And believe it or not, by 1860, which is the start of the Civil War, about 12,000 people had been resettled. I know it's not a lot, but 12,000, it's a okay sized number. The last thing was immediate peaceful emancipation. And William Lloyd Garrison, perhaps one of the best known abolitionists, or one of the best known certainly, he had a magazine and or newspaper, and he published a pamphlet called The Liberator, which advocated immediate peaceful emancipation. And while this might have been, pretty good in terms of, being idealistic, and being sort of, hey, everything's gonna get along, it's just gonna happen, without the threat of force, or without the threat of, hey, you need to do what we say or else, you just have to appeal to people, say, hey, can you please, end slavery? And that is typically not a very successful way. But Garrison did go on to become a major figure and founded one of the largest abolition societies, the American Anti-Slavery Society. Well, believe it or not, there were people who were opposed to abolitionism. And, this is not a very, excuse me, this is not a very well reasoned argument, but the people opposed to abolition, they were really reduced to physical um, violence, and their arguments didn't really have much moral weight to them at all. Excuse me again, pardon me. And so they really had to do is intimidate people. When we say physically prevented distribution of material, abolitionist literature was intercepted and burned. Anytime we talk about book burning, that always is not a good thing. Some abolitionists came under attack, and even some were killed. And the other reason, some opposed it for economic reasons, and they felt that the cotton industry would be ruined, and therefore the economy would suffer abolition. Those were the reasons. They're not very convincing, but those were they were. All right, that is it. Thank you for listening.